Dear colleagues, greetings from Russia. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers for making this long-awaited Congress possible. I regret not being able to attend it in person, but I appreciate the chance to take part in it online. Polyglottery, that is, proficiency in multiple languages as a result of conscious study in adulthood, in the past was regarded as a mysterious phenomenon. However, it is now a rapidly developing field of research. Since the previous ISAPL Congress in 2021, which also included a symposium on polyglot studies, this topic has been discussed annually at 5 international psycholinguistics conferences and 3 specialized seminars in Russia. Literature on polyglottery, comprised of polyglot memoirs and research publications, now amounts to more than 130 titles, including 2 successfully defended doctoral dissertations. I believe all this makes a significant contribution to applied psycholinguistics, as it makes it possible to model polyglots' outstanding achievements in general language education. This symposium introduces and summarizes the latest findings in this field. The Russian polyglot, Mr. Alan Begulov, will speak about his revolutionary experiment of AI-based language learning. Another Russian polyglot, Mr. Yan Alishkevich Suslov, will discuss the concept of the language of thought by reference to the process of grammar construction acquisition by polyglots. A researcher from Saudi Arabia, Mrs. Albandari Al-Hassan, will present the results of her study concerning hyperpolyglots' language learning experiences. Myself, I would like to share some ideas concerning the cognitive and motivational nature of polyglottery. I hope you will find our presentations of interest. I thank you for your attention and look forward to our collaboration in the future. Dear colleagues, my name is Grigory Kazakov, and I'm happy to share with you today the results of some of my studies concerning the nature of polyglottery. One of the central problems of modern science is understanding the principles of brain function and modeling them in technology, education, and other practical fields. Language is one of the higher functions of human psyche and the main instrument of communication between people. So understanding how it works in the minds of polyglots who demonstrate highly efficient language acquisition and language use could be very valuable for both fundamental research and various applications in society. First of all, let's start with the definitions of the main terms. Polyglottery, as consciously achieved individual multilingualism, should be distinguished from multilingualism in the narrow sense, that is, unconscious acquisition of multiple languages in childhood when a person is raised in a family or an area where more than one language is spoken. And it should also be distinguished from polyglossia, the sociolinguistic situation when multiple languages coexist in one area or in one society. In this light, a polyglot can be defined as a person who possesses functional proficiency in at least 5 foreign languages consciously learned, after puberty. How do we know how polyglots learn languages, how they use them, and how things work in their mind? Well, there are several sources of data. The first of them is polyglot memoirs. These are books written by polyglots themselves from the first-person perspective, where they tell their stories, how they came to be interested in language learning, what methods they used, how they work with different languages. And normally these books also contain various practical recommendations for learners of languages on how to do it. Another source, which developed in recent years, is research literature. Now there are dozens of journal articles, several books of conference proceedings, and even dissertations on polyglottery, which present a scientific, that is, an outside observer's perspective on polyglots. Scholars observe how polyglots learn languages. They make different notes, try to determine certain tendencies, and they share this knowledge in research publications. And finally, a vast source of information about polyglots is materials of the modern polyglot movement, mostly in the form of talks, which are recorded and available online from the annual polyglot conferences and polyglot gatherings, where polyglots actually get together, give papers, talks, and discuss how they learn languages, how they use languages, and different related issues. Well, analyzing these available sources, and literature in polyglottery now amounts to more than 130 titles, has led me to formulate the following hypothesis concerning how polyglottery is formed in people. It includes 4 main points. Point 1, polyglots' language achievements can be explained on the brain level by the concept of brain efficiency, or in other words, cognitive skills. Polyglots in their minds develop the skills of learning languages, and like other skills, they enable them to do something quickly, more efficiently than other people lacking those skills would do. Point 2, this brain efficiency is based on the capacity of the brain to specialize in order to solve priority tasks. So brain can identify a certain activity as a priority one and can direct its resources to developing efficient ways of performing this particular activity. So likewise, this can be done with languages and language learning. Brain specialization for this particular function is developed. But how does it happen in polyglots? It happens through regular practice of their own self-study algorithms. Polyglots try different methods. They come to understand themselves and to know what actually works for them in terms of optimal language acquisition. They develop their own strategies of language learning and practice them again and again on a regular, actually daily basis. And this regular practice leads to specialization in this particular activity, later leading to the development of uh, relevant functions in the brain. But why do polyglots manage to develop these specialized functions and other people who learn or try to learn foreign languages for years in school or outside school at the tertiary level or independently? Why do other people, ordinary people, don't get the same results in spite of their seeming regular practice of languages? It seems to me that the other lies in the area of motivation. Polyglots have stable internal motivation to keep practicing those self-study algorithms. While an ordinary person might try to learn a language and work on it for a while, but can lose this motivation once he or she encounters some obstacles or once the initial enthusiasm disappears. And this is inevitable. Polyglots, like other people, experience uh, fluctuations of mood. They can feel frustrated. They can feel disappointed uh, about language learning, but they don't give up. They keep their daily practice, while an ordinary learner might just give up at the first moment when they stop feeling so inspired by the language learning process. So polyglots have this deep, sustainable motivation. All this seems to indicate that volitional aspects of personality play the key role in achieving and developing polyglottery, volitional functions such as motivation in the first place. And this actually makes polyglots similar to expert performers in other fields, professional athletes, chess masters, or professional musicians. We've identified that motivation seems to be the source of energy for language study, which enables polyglots to develop and practice those language learning algorithms, which eventually lead to the development of brain efficiency with regard to language learning. But in psychology, the problem of motivation doesn't have a single and definitive solution. There are various theories. But one of those theories seems to be particularly consistent with the data of polyglottery. That is the self-determination theory. It posits that human behavior is driven by three basic needs, that intrinsic motivation has its source in three uh, innate needs: need for autonomy, the need of a person to feel that they decide something in their own life, that they are the cause of their own actions, the need for competence, to feel that you're competent in any particular area, that you can deserve some respect. You can respect yourself and you can deserve the respect of others by certain achievements, at least in some specialized areas. And the need for relatedness, sense of belonging, needs to be connected with other people. So, as I've mentioned, this seems to be very consonant with what we see in polyglots. For example, an American polyglot, Martin Bragalone, based on his own experience, writes that language learning helps to satisfy such personal needs as the need for certainty, variety, significance, connection with others, personal growth, and contribution to society. An Italian researcher, Claudia Pellegrini, who defended the first doctoral dissertation on polyglottery in the world, based on interviews with a number of polyglots, identifies the main motives of language learning in polyglots as the desire for mutual understanding with native speakers of other languages, interest in other cultures, just the pleasure of speaking foreign languages, as well as general self-improvement and expansion of one's own cognitive potential. The Russian linguist Dina Nikulicheva, the author of 2 books on polyglots, strategies of language learning in Russian, comes to similar conclusions, connecting polyglots' goal setting with the needs of creative self-identification, self-development, and self-expression. I think we can generalize all this, but by saying that the source of motivation for polyglots is perceiving language as a tool for self-fulfillment. It's not just an outside task that one needs to accomplish for work or for study purposes, but it's something which forms part of their architecture of personality, if we can say so. Language is seen as something that enables a polyglot to accomplish their general life goals. The priority role of motivation is also confirmed by data from psychology and methodology of language teaching. For example, Larissa Khokhlova, in her doctoral dissertation on the psychophysiological predisposition factors with regard to language learning, concludes that a lack of predisposition for language learning can be actually compensated for by a high level of motivation, while insufficient level of motivation can actually prevent a person from realizing their existing cognitive potential properly. A well-known American psycholinguist, Stephen Krashen, analyzing different methods of language teaching, comes to the conclusion that the most effective of those are the methods that focus specifically on removing the psychological barrier, in his terminology, effective filter. That is, the methods that focus on reducing anxiety and increasing motivation. Those methods he considers to be the most efficient ones. So, what does all this reveal about the nature of polyglottery? I think this indicates that the cognitive perspective on polyglottery, that is, understanding only the mechanisms of how they absorb, store, and retrieve linguistic information, this perspective is not enough to actually understand how polyglots become polyglots. So this is just the point of application. Yes, they have these mechanisms, these cognitive skills of working with language information in their mind. But this is just an area where more general, more universal skills, to my mind, are applied by polyglots, which is indirectly supported by the fact that most polyglots are actually not professional linguists, but successful people of different professions: businessmen, diplomats, scientists, and professional performers in various areas. So they have those skills of efficiency in their minds, which, being applied to various areas, can lead to success in those areas. So we need something else besides the cognitive perspective to understand the development of polyglottery, which is those motivational, or more broadly speaking, volitional aspects of personality: motivation, goal setting, self-control when working towards the achievement of one's goals, etc. And this, to me, indicates the need for a more holistic psychological description of polyglottery, which will include not only the cognitive, intellectual aspects, but also the volitional and emotional aspects of both polyglots' personalities and of their language learning processes. And this, interestingly, reminds us of Aristotle's idea of cognition as will as two intrinsic faculties of the soul. That is, seeing, cognition, the thinking process, working with information, and volitional functions, motivation, goal setting, etc., as two fundamental but different from each other functions of the human psyche. And this leads me to propose, by way of a hypothesis, the volitional cognitive model of polyglottery, which I've tried to lay out in this presentation, as a model that might explain the facts that we know about polyglottery at the moment. These are some of the sources that I've used and cited. Thank you for your kind attention, and I'll be happy to discuss these ideas by way of email or otherwise if you wish. Thank you once again.
Good morning, colleagues. It's a great honor to join you today for the 13th International Congress of the International Society for Applied Psycholinguistics. I would like to begin by thanking the Congress Chair, Professor Juliana Novo-Gomez, the Society's Organizing and Scientific Committee, Professor Grigory Kazakov, who organized our Symposium, Recent Trends in Polyglot Studies, and all Congress participants watching this session. My presentation is titled Entering Conversational Practice in German Through AI Tutors, the Hyper-Intensive Method Study. It presents an experiment investigation whether a careful design system of AI tutors can replace human language partners during the first functional stage of speaking development. As a researcher of language learning practices and methodologies, at the time I began the experiment, I was not aware of documented cases in which a learner had developed spoken ability from an almost zero level using exclusively AI tutors, with a verifiable language outcome. There are many examples of AI being used as a supplementary tool in language learning, but substantially less evidence regarding AI functioning as the sole provider of linguistic input and conversational interaction. This made the research question quite concrete. Is it possible to enter conversational practice in a foreign language, starting from an almost zero level, using only AI tutors, and not within an unlimited time frame, but through a hyper-intensive method aimed at achieving a clearly operational communicative result? The broader question is whether AI can provide sufficient interaction, feedback, and communicative pressure for speaking ability to begin developing. This experiment continues the line of research surrounding the hyper-intensive method that I developed during the project 10 Languages in 1000 Days. Professor Dina Nikulicheva presented her observations on that project at the 12th, the International Society of Applied Psycholinguistics International Congress, held in June 2021, and later discussed it in the 2022 Signo article, Waves of Intensity in Language Learning, Polyglot Alan Bigulov's project 10 Languages in 1000 Days. She also published a separate study based on her own experience, testing the strategy of hyper-intensive entry into conversational practice. These publications provide important methodological context for the present study. The current experiment does not introduce the hyper-intensive approach from the beginning. Rather, it addresses a new question within the same methodological tradition. Can the hyper-intensive method be effectively adapted when human tutors and native speakers are replaced during the learning phase exclusively by AI tutors? In order to evaluate whether AI tutors could support entry into conversational practice, the experiment adapted the core principles of the hyper-intensive method to an AI-mediated environment. The method is based on several interconnected components: periods of controlled hyper-intensive immersion, student-operated learning, the tutor functioning as a language sparring partner, the use of a personal conversational course, and the concept of a linguo-communicative situation. Hyper-intensive immersion involves concentrated daily speaking-oriented practice, typically 3 to 5 hours per day over approximately 10 days, with alternating periods of high and lower intensity. The learning process is student-led. The learner takes initiative, directs the lesson, and follows a structured communicative plan rather than relying on teacher-driven instruction. Within this framework, the tutor functions primarily as a language sparring partner rather than as a traditional lecturer, sustaining interaction through live responses, corrections, prompts, and conversational support. Vocabulary and grammar are acquired through immediate communicative use and contextual correction during lessons and through work with the personal conversational course. The methodological question in this experiment was whether AI tutors could perform these functions sufficiently effectively to support the initial development of spoken interaction in a foreign language. In the hyper-intensive method, entry into conversational practice represents the first operational stage of spoken language development. It refers to the ability to maintain a 30-minute conversation with an unfamiliar native speaker without long pauses, without switching into the learner's native language, and without causing significant communicative discomfort for the interlocutor. The conversation is a genuinely spontaneous interaction. Topics are not agreed upon in advance. Communicative comfort means that the learner possesses sufficient active vocabulary to sustain the interaction, understands the interlocutor well enough to follow the conversation, does not produce errors that block comprehension, and can resolve communicative difficulties within the target language itself. The experiment was originally planned for 100 days, beginning on December 1st, 2024. In practice, however, the target outcome was reached earlier, on January 31st, 2025, meaning that the active learning phase lasted 62 days. My spoken German at the outset was close to zero. I had previously attempted to study German years earlier through a non-hyper-intensive approach, but I had no meaningful speaking experience, and my active vocabulary was limited to a small number of common words. The central methodological principle of the experiment was the isolation of the AI factor. No human teachers, no human language partners, no textbooks, no grammar manuals, and no conventional learning resources during the learning phase. All interaction and practice were conducted through AI platforms. The total logged learning time amounted to 131 hours, including 52.5 hours of targeted oral practice. I created an ecosystem of AI tutors using chatbot platforms and 11 labs for voice interaction. Across the experiment, I created approximately 30 tutor versions, while the final working ecosystem consisted of 21 specialized tutors. 10 academic tutors were created primarily for vocabulary expansion, lexical development, and topic-based language enrichment. 11 were community tutors designed to simulate ordinary native speakers in informal conversation. For each tutor, I prepared detailed documentation, including biographical and professional profiles, lesson behavior algorithms, methodological instructions, and principles for conducting student-operated lessons. This diversity was intended to avoid the perception of interacting with a single faceless system and to create a wider range of communicative situations. I would like to invite you to watch a 1-minute excerpt from one of my lessons with AI tutors. Activate Leonie.
Guten Tag, Alan Bigulov. Schön, Sie zu sehen. Ich bin Dr. Eichmann. Bereit für unsere Deutschstunde? Ich habe mich schon ein wenig über Ihr Interesse an der KI-gestützten Sprachlernerfahrung informiert. Wie geht's Ihnen heute?
Mir geht es gut, danke. Es freut mich auch, Sie kennenzulernen und mit Ihnen Deutsch zu üben. Heute ich möchte mit Ihnen erste Frage von Dokument Short Experiment zu üben. Können Sie bitte erste Frage zu lesen?
Das freut mich sehr zu hören, Alan. Es ist mir auch eine Freude, Sie kennenzulernen und Sie beim Deutschlernen zu unterstützen. Gerne lese ich die erste Frage für Sie vor. Sie stammt aus dem Abschnitt über das Experiment. Hier ist die Frage auf Englisch. What was Alan's primary goal for his AI-powered language learning experiment?
I tracked all learning activity over the 2-month period in order to obtain objective time data. The total amounted to 131 hours. As the graph shows, the process was not linear. It followed the wave-like structure of the hyper-intensive method, periods of high-intensity practice followed by lower-intensity consolidation phases. The first intensive wave focused primarily on basic structures, vocabulary acquisition, and learning to manage the AI tutoring process itself. The second wave focused on voice interaction and preparation for conversations with native speakers in real communicative settings. Of the total time, 52.5 hours consisted specifically of oral practice with AI tutors. This distinction is important because the method is based not only on total study time, but on concentrated conversational pressure. This slide illustrates the transition from text-based work during the first weeks of the experiment to later voice-based practice. After the first 2 weeks, my spoken ability was still only at an embryonic stage. Text interaction helped me organize lessons, develop tutor prompts, and build foundational learning material. But speaking ability began to develop seriously only after I moved to sustained voice interaction with AI tutors. The most effective tutor versions were developed after the new year. At that point, it became possible to organize a series of productive voice-based lessons, and the growth of speaking ability became proportional both to the number of oral practice hours and to the quality of the tutor design. For beginners, meta-communication is crucial. The learner must be able to manage the lesson before becoming capable of speaking fluently in the target language. During the experiment, I used English for meta-communication with the AI tutors. In this experiment, I devoted greater attention to evaluation procedures than in my earlier language learning experiments. The results were assessed from several perspectives: native speakers, independent experts in German language teaching, self-observation, and computer-assisted linguistic analysis of dialogue transcripts. 2 experts in German language teaching monitored my progress from the first week of the experiment. Both followed my Telegram experiment diary, and I also had several online meetings with them at different stages of the study. At times, they spontaneously switched to German during our conversations, which gave them a direct impression of my developing speaking ability prior to the final conversations with native speakers. By the end of January, I felt ready to test the result with real native speakers. On January 31st, the 62nd day of the experiment, I scheduled 6 45-minute free conversation sessions on italki with different unfamiliar German speakers. None of them knew me, my methodology, or how long I had been studying German. The conversations began spontaneously and covered a range of topics, including small talk, travel, hobbies, and more complex discussion of the experiment itself. From the first minute, I spoke exclusively in German and did not switch to English. In total, this was my first real experience speaking with native German speakers, and it lasted approximately 4 hours across the day. After the first conversation, I already understood that entry into conversational practice had occurred. The remaining conversations further confirmed it. Each final conversation lasted approximately 40 minutes and was conducted in German. At the end, the interlocutors provided brief feedback in English. Their evaluations were remarkably consistent. They assessed the speaking performance as being approximately at the B1 level rather than A2, and emphasized that the interaction was sufficiently comfortable and natural to be sustained. I subsequently provided recordings of these conversations to independent experts for evaluation. Their conclusions closely aligned with the impressions of the native speakers. They noted the relative fluency of the speech, the absence of a strong language barrier, and the learner's willingness to communicate as a major strength. For the purposes of this study, the key point is the convergence of these evaluations. Native speakers, independent experts, and my own observations all pointed toward the same overall outcome. Alongside qualitative feedback, I also conducted a quantitative analysis of my speech in conversations with native speakers and language experts. For this purpose, I developed a computer program for the linguistic analysis of German dialogue transcripts. The input consisted of transcripts containing only the learner's utterances extracted from the dialogues. The output was a text-based report including several dozen metrics, such as lexical analysis, syntactic analysis, discourse features, fluency indicators, readability measures, filler words, and hesitation markers. Across the analyzed spontaneous conversations conducted over a 2-month period, the program identified a total of 1,060 unique lemmas as determined by Spacey and TextStat. This made it possible, for the first time within this line of research, to document the hyper-intensive learning outcome not only qualitatively through human feedback, but also quantitatively through comparable transcript-based data. These charts show changes in conversation duration, average segment length, unique lemmas, hesitation markers, readability, and syntactic complexity. The overall pattern suggests that speech became more extended and structurally complex, while the learner retained the ability to sustain interaction. Readability scores decreased, which in this context indicates that the utterances became more complex in terms of vocabulary and grammatical structure. Dependency depth also increased. These metrics do not, by themselves, prove fluency. However, they support the same interpretation reached by the human evaluators. The final conversations were not rehearsed fragments, but spontaneous speech demonstrating measurable lexical and syntactic development. To determine whether the result was merely a short-term effect of the hyper-intensive period, I conducted a delayed control conversation 3 months after the conclusion of the main experiment. During those 3 months, there was a complete break from German practice. On May 1st, 2025, I held a conversation with an unfamiliar native speaker, Maya. Before the conversation, she was informed that it formed part of the experiment and agreed to complete a feedback questionnaire afterward. The conversation lasted 57 minutes. The questionnaire consisted of 27 items based on the hyper-intensive methods criteria for conversational practice. The result was significant. The level of entry into conversational practice was preserved without any obvious loss of active vocabulary. Fluency was slightly reduced and some grammatical issues remained, particularly with verb placement. But these difficulties were minor and did not substantially affect the overall quality of communication. A separate result of the experiment concerns the psycholinguistic experience of prolonged interaction with AI tutors. At first, the interaction can feel surprisingly natural, especially when high-quality voice models and carefully designed tutor personas are used. However, during sustained intensive practice, I observed a cumulative, uncanny valley-like effect. This was not a visual phenomenon, but rather a communicative and emotional one. The tutor simulates encouragement, interest, and empathy, yet over time, the learner gradually perceives the absence of genuine personal experience or reciprocal human presence behind the voice. This may produce a sense of emotional emptiness or mechanical exchange and can reduce motivation once the initial novelty diminishes. From the perspective of AI language learning design, this is not merely a minor cosmetic issue. Intensive speaking practice depends heavily on attention, emotional engagement, and interpersonal trust. Therefore, AI tutors require compensatory strategies, greater persona variation, more natural turn-taking dynamics, less repetitive questioning patterns, explicit lesson protocols, and in many cases, hybrid interaction with human teachers or speakers. The experiment revealed both the advantages and the limitations of AI tutors. The advantages are clear: 24-hour availability, flexible scheduling, the possibility of customizing tutors to a specific methodology, reduced social pressure, analytical feedback, and significantly lower practice costs compared to regular human tutoring. With careful prompting, AI tutors can also discuss complex and abstract topics, rather than being limited to simple textbook dialogues. However, important weaknesses also became apparent. AI tutors often tend to adopt an interview-like interaction style, repeatedly asking questions instead of participating as equal conversational partners. They require constant methodological guidance. Most importantly, they lack genuine emotional presence, cultural experience, and human reciprocity. During prolonged intensive interaction, this may produce an uncanny valley-like sense of emotional emptiness or mechanical exchange. The practical conclusion is not that AI tutors should replace human teachers. Rather, a more realistic interpretation is that AI tutors can serve as powerful infrastructure for intensive language practice, particularly in situations where access to native speakers or teachers is limited, or where learners need to develop spoken ability rapidly. The method may be especially valuable for self-directed learners with clearly defined goals, or when implemented under methodological supervision. For developers, the experiment suggests several important requirements: diverse tutor personas, explicit behavioral protocols, support for meta-communication, high-quality voice interaction, and integrated progress analytics. For researchers, the next step is replication with larger samples, different language pairs, and hybrid models that combine AI-based interaction with the emotional, cultural, and social depth provided by human communication. To conclude, the experiment provided a positive answer to the central research question. In this documented N1 case, entry into conversational practice was achievable using AI tutors alone, starting from an almost zero level in German. The hyper-intensive method proved adaptable to AI-mediated language learning, and the outcome was supported through conversations with native speakers, evaluations by independent experts, transcript-based metrics, and a 3-month follow-up. However, this should not be interpreted as a universal claim. The method requires substantial technical and methodological preparation, a high degree of self-discipline, and psychological readiness for intensive interaction with non-human interlocutors. AI tutors are a highly effective instrument, especially for learners with clear goals, but they cannot fully replace human interaction in its emotional, cultural, and social dimensions. Thank you for your attention.
Greetings to everyone joining us for the 13th ISAPL International Congress. I'd like to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to Prof. Juliana Gooms, the chair of the Congress, and to the ISAPL organizing a scientific committee for their exceptional work in bringing this global community together. My thanks also go to the professor, the organizing of our symposium, and to all participants who are watching this session, whether they are live or online. My name is Bandri Abdullah Hassan, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Symposium number 2, that is entitled Navigating the Linguistic Spectrum, a qualitative exploration of hyperpolyglots acquisition, retention, and attrition experiences. Before we begin, let me briefly the structure of our symposium and the presenters who will contribute to this rich discussion. Today's symposium include the symposium overview, that is the subject itself, and I'm starting asking some questions as a presenter that was to my mind and try to find answers to them. For the main presentation here, or for the main study we have, let's talk about, first of all, about hyperpolyglots. Hyperpolyglots, they are individuals who actively use 6 or more languages. And they represent one of the most fascinating and least understood linguistic profiles in the multilingual spectrum. Now, their experiences challenge traditional models of language acquisition, cognitive processing, and sociocultural adaptation. Now, I will highlight 3 major areas. We will talk about acquisition in number 1, retention, number 2, and in number 3, we will discuss what is Let me start with acquisition. Hyperpolyglots do not follow linear learning paths, but instead their journey are shaped by intrinsic motivation, emotional resonance with languages, cultural identity formation, and neurocognitive flexibility. Now, from this study, when we have the interviews with the hyperpolyglots, they revealed that, or many of them, describe language learning as a deeply personal event, and something that, or a process that connects them to their communities, to their histories, and to their inner narratives. On the other hand, we have retention, which emerged as a dynamic, ongoing practice, and participants emphasize these 4 points. They talk about daily immersion, social interaction, emotional attachment to languages, and this is very important, and finally, strategic activation routines. For this, we find that retention was strongest when languages were tied together, or they had a meaningful relationship, professional use, or cultural belonging. Now, in number 3, attrition was described not as a failure from the point of view of the participants. They described attrition as a natural part of their multilingual life. Participants reported that decline often begins in production, but not in comprehension. And usually it is triggered by reduced exposure. These are the main reasons they mentioned: reduced exposure, shifting priorities, cognitive load, and emotional distance from the language. Now, yet many of those hyperpolyglots demonstrated remarkable resilience concerning languages, using episodic reactivation, passive input, and identity-based motivation to recover lost proficiency. Now, what is the theoretical contribution of our study? The major finding we have that the findings that we have, it's challenge linear second language acquisition model and support dynamic cyclical frameworks such as the dynamic multilingual model and cross-linguistic influence theories enriched with emotional and contextual dimensions. Now, this study also reinforces the importance of metacognition, linear autonomy, strategic flexibility, and digital immersion. Now, when we have some questions that may come to our to minds, as a first question, what surprised me as a researcher to focus on what is the most emotional dimension of hyper polyglots experiences? Now, one of the most striking findings was how deeply languages were tied to identity, how they are related to the participants' identity, because they describe languages as emotional anchors, something that have meaning or self-expression to them. Not only attrition also has this point, was not just a cognitive, it's not a loss for them, it was experienced as a threat to identity. Now, if we can ask ourselves, how do we immersion shaping the acquisition in this study, we find that immersion, whether it is physical or digital, or is it social, because we have so many sorts of immersion found in this, or emerged in this study. Now, immersion here creates the conditions for the rapid acquisition and long-term retention. What stood out in this study is how hyperpolyglots construct their own immersion environments, even when living outside the target culture. Now, also we find that technology has an important role in this. Hi from Porto, and warm greetings to everyone. Now, for technology, we said that technology has an important, it emerged as an important factor in this study, and we find that the participants, whether they use the technology, whether using, it became a personalized immersion tool. For the implications of the findings for language education, we can say that now these findings, they suggest that education should be cyclic. And the interviews showed that hyperpolyglots experience language development as a cyclical, not linear progression. They move fluidly between acquisition, retention, and attrition depending on emotional resonance. And our participant demonstrated that multilingual competence is not a stable endpoint, but it is a constant, it is a state of negotiation until we reach a final, or they reach a final point. Now, one important thing, what is our future direction based on the findings on this study? I believe that we need a deeper exploration of identity of hyperpolyglots. Now, the way languages shape themselves as a self-concept, they reveal that language is not just a tool, but a psychological space. And this is one of the priorities that we need. At last, I'd like to thank you for attending this, for having this symposium, and for listening. listening and letting me the chance for participating. Thank you. What is our future?